Hello, fellow Sapiens, and a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you are lying under blankets with eyes half closed, walking alone beneath streetlights, or listening as dawn slips quietly through your window, this space is for you. Because tonight, we trace the hidden collapse of 90% of Europe's prehistoric male bloodlines. This is contemplative storytelling and deep time science for wandering minds. It is an untold story of ancient disappearance, a 5,000-year-old fracture hidden beneath silence and sediment. But what if this disappearance was not caused by famine or failure, but by arrival and... If you are someone who finds beauty in long-form mysteries, in forgotten bones and soft questions, then you are in good company. Consider tapping like and subscribe. Only if this kind of storytelling feels like home. That small gesture helps others find their way to these slower stories too. And while we drift into deep time, I wonder, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing it in the comments, it's always a quiet reminder that we are listening together, across time zones and worlds. Oh, and if your eyes begin to close as we go, that is perfectly fine. Timestamps are waiting in the description when you return. Now, we begin with a silence in the blood. It happened once, and it happened fast. Almost every male bloodline across prehistoric Europe disappeared, not in a single night, but in evolutionary terms, in the blink of an eye. Over just a few short centuries, the paternal lineages of Neolithic men were erased, leaving behind almost no genetic echo. Across much of the continent, 9 out of every 10 ancestral Y chromosomes vanished from the record. And what makes this more haunting is that the maternal lines remained. The women endured. Their mitochondrial DNA continues through time with barely a break. But the fathers simply stop. This is not myth, it is data. And the silence began speaking in the year 2015, when teams of geneticists compared the Y chromosomes of ancient European skeletons to those of modern men. They expected drift. They found destruction. In regions like Britain and Iberia, almost none of the paternal ancestry from early farmers survived into the present day. It was not just one area. The pattern repeated again and again. Local male lines had disappeared, and in their place emerged a new signature, one not previously seen in these lands. The discovery caused a quiet shift in how prehistory was understood. Until then, most reconstructions of ancient Europe had focused on cultural layers, pots, burial rites, languages, tools. But here was something deeper, a replacement not only of how people lived, but of who their fathers were. Not just the exchange of ideas, the exchange of blood. What researchers found especially strange was the contrast. The women's lineage remained continuous, as though communities had carried on. Yet the men had almost entirely changed. That kind of split is unusual in human history. It suggests something deeply asymmetrical. Not extinction, but replacement. Not the end of life, but the end of lineage. The pattern is not subtle. It does not require speculation, and yet its cause remains difficult to name with certainty. There are no monuments that tell the story, no epic battle scenes carved into stone, no remembered songs of loss, no myth of an invasion. The men simply vanished from the record, leaving only bones, and then not even that. Even today, most people are unaware of this moment. It left no crater, no ruin, no tale. But in the blood of millions, it left a fingerprint. The collapse of male ancestry did not erase humanity. It rewrote the shape of fatherhood across an entire continent. The stories of the children continued. But the voices of the men who once held them are missing. What vanished was not the species. What vanished was the memory of one kind of man. And now, only a question remains. Who replaced them? And why? In the genetic record, the change is unmistakable. Around 5,000 years ago, across large parts of Europe, the Y chromosome lineages of Neolithic men collapse. These were the genetic markers passed from father to son, generation after generation, unbroken through time. Then, in what seems like a sudden compression, those lines falter. They do not thin, they vanish. Within just a few centuries, the majority are gone. In many regions, the lineages that had been dominant for thousands of years all but disappear, replaced by different ones with no local ancestry. but the maternal lines remain. The mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, shows remarkable continuity. Women's ancestry remains largely rooted in the earlier Neolithic populations. This split between fading fathers and enduring mothers is not easily explained. It suggests that the people themselves were not entirely destroyed. Communities continued to function. Children were still born. But the identities of their fathers had changed. At some point, the thread of paternal inheritance was picked up by different hands. The archaeological record offers few clear answers. There are no continent-wide layers of ash or ruin, no obvious evidence of genocide or sudden population collapse. Instead, what we find are patterns of change, a gradual shift in burial customs, settlements that fade and are not rebuilt, pottery styles that vanish and are replaced. In the bones themselves, subtle differences in morphology. In the grave goods, hints of a different social order. And later, the genes begin to change. What's striking is the absence of visible trauma. If a mass extermination had taken place, we would expect signs, burned villages, mass graves, war scars on skeletons. But instead we see something quieter. It is almost as if society continued without disruption, while underneath, its foundations were quietly reset. This is what makes the disappearance of the male lineages so difficult to detect without genetic tools. It left no written record, only silence and the reshaping of ancestry. This transformation did not happen everywhere at once. The genetic turnover moved in waves like shadow over a field at dusk. In some places, the new paternal lines appear suddenly, as if carried in with a migrating population. In others, the shift is more gradual, suggesting a slow process of integration and dominance. But wherever it arrived, the outcome was consistent. One set of male ancestors vanishes, a different set takes their place. And all the while, the maternal line flows steadily through both, as though nothing had changed. The asymmetry is telling. Male-biased genetic replacement on this scale is rare in prehistory. It does not result from accident. It requires structure, either cultural or biological, a system that selects certain men to reproduce while excluding others. That exclusion may come from social dominance, violent conflict, or deeper hierarchies that determine who's allowed to leave descendants. And in this case, the scale of replacement suggests something systematic. Not a moment of destruction, but a transformation that was sustained and enforced over time. To say more at this point would risk stepping beyond what the evidence confirms. The causes remain unnamed, for now. But the outcome is clear. What occurred in this window of time was not natural, and it was not random. Something shifted in the architecture of inheritance itself, and that shift was not gentle. It left no ruins behind, but it left a fracture in the bloodlines of millions. And so we begin the search not only for what was lost, but for what replaced it. A people not yet fully seen, a presence that rewrote the ancestry of a continent and did so in near silence. Their story waits further ahead, but their shadow has already entered the frame. So what can silence the fathers of a continent without ending the lives of their children? It is not a question with a simple answer, but it is one that leaves traces, not in the landscape, but in the lineage. In many ways, this is what makes the disappearance so unsettling. The world continued, the weather changed, crops grew, people moved from place to place. But beneath it all, a thread had snapped and been replaced. The Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, is especially vulnerable to cultural change. In societies where male lineage determines status, inheritance, or social power, even a small shift in who is allowed to reproduce can erase other lines entirely. Over just a few generations, entire branches of ancestry can vanish, not by catastrophe, but by exclusion. This kind of replacement leaves almost no material evidence. It unfolds within households, not on battlefields. It happens in silence. It is not always violent, but it is always selective. And over time, it reshapes the identity of a people from the inside out. When we look back at the genetic shift, we find no sign of famine or plague that would target only men. Diseases do not erase fathers and spare mothers. Nature rarely draws such a clean line, but culture does. Culture determines marriage patterns, inheritance rules, and kinship systems. And through those systems, one group can erase the legacy of another, not by killing them, but by becoming the only ones whose sons remain. The genetic data tells us only what happened. It does not tell us how, it does not tell us why, but it allows us to ask better questions. Why do we find such strong continuity in female ancestry and such disruption in male ancestry? Why do certain paternal lineages begin to dominate so completely after this point in time? And why do these same lineages appear, with eerie consistency, across regions that had never before shared such genetic ties? What we are seeing may not be the aftermath of a war. It may be the emergence of a new kind of order, one shaped not by conquest in the open, but by dominance in the home, the hearth, and the ritual. A change in the rules of who belonged, of who could marry, of who could father children, and whose name would vanish from the blood of nations. The answers lie beyond the horizon of this chapter, but the pattern is real, and the consequences echo forward, not only in genomes, but in the systems of power that followed. In many ways, this moment marks a turning point in European prehistory. Before this, the continent was a patchwork of farming communities, rooted in the land, shaped by rivers, forests, and stone. These Neolithic societies had cultivated the earth for millennia. They built homes from timber and clay. They buried their dead with care. They mapped the seasons into the soil. Their ancestry stretched back to the first farmers who crossed into Europe from the Near East, bringing seeds, livestock, and a new way of life. Afterward, something else begins to spread. Not all at once, not with fire and sword, but steadily, purposefully. A different rhythm, a different way of organising people, a different idea of who carries the future. New artefacts appear in the archaeological record. New burial mounds rise across the hills. Horses, wheels and wagons follow, symbols of mobility, control and hierarchy, and with them, a different inheritance pattern begins to take root. The male lines that rose to prominence during this time remain dominant in Europe to this day. Two particular Y chromosome haplogroups, known to geneticists as R1a and R1b, begin to spread across vast regions. Before this period, they are nearly absent in the genetic record. After it, they are nearly everywhere, in modern European men from Ireland to India. This is not a random drift. It is a demographic shift of enormous scale. A genetic bottleneck so selective it reshaped the continent's paternal heritage in just a few generations, and yet it remains invisible to the eye. No ruins mark its progress. No victory stele records its passage. Only by sequencing ancient DNA were researchers able to detect it. Without those genomes, the story would still be hidden beneath the fields and forests of modern Europe. What it reveals is that our sense of continuity, the idea that our ancestors slowly passed the world down to us, is more complicated than we imagined. There were ruptures, sharp ones, and some of them happened not thousands of years ago, but just beyond the reach of recorded history, in a time we thought we understood, a time of cattle herders and farming villages, a time of stone tools and wooden ploughs. But beneath that quiet surface, something irreversible had begun. What makes this change so unusual is how one-sided it was. The genes of the women continued. Their mitochondrial DNA remained stable through the upheaval. The customs of the land, though altered, evolved more gradually. But the fathers, the ones whose names do not survive, whose bones are sometimes not even marked, were replaced almost entirely, and whoever took their place carried with them something more than DNA. They brought new ideas of structure, new rules of descent, a different emphasis on kinship, inheritance, and authority. And while the women's ancestry remained, the social systems around them shifted. Perhaps even their roles within those systems changed. But the transformation was not only genetic, it was civilizational. It shaped who could own land, who could lead, who could father sons, and whose legacy would be forgotten. This was not just a change in the bloodline, it was a change in the blueprint of society. And though it began in silence, its echo has never fully faded. Ahead lies the question, not just of who arrived, but how they came to stay, and why once they entered nearly all other fathers were written out of history. This is where the mystery sharpens, and where the silence grows loudest. Because if the genetic signal is this clear, and the cultural traces so faint, then what we are looking at is not just a shift in people, but in power. Power over reproduction, power over memory, power over who gets to become an ancestor. For most of human history, ancestry was not tracked with letters and samples. It was carried in names, in oral traditions, in the faces of children and the shape of bones. But in this case, the names are gone. The stories were never passed down, and the bones tell only fragments. What we're left with is not history as it was told, but history as it was lived, and then hidden. We often think of ancient history as a sequence of innovations: fire, farming, bronze. But alongside each of these came something more invisible: systems, hierarchies, lineages, and with them the ability to determine whose blood would carry forward and whose would stop. These structures are rarely visible in the archaeological record. They are enacted in marriage patterns, inheritance laws, and customs that shape who is seen as kin and who is not. This moment, this collapse of male lineages, is not the only one in human history, but it is among the most dramatic we have ever uncovered. And it forces us to reconsider how human societies change, not always through conquest, not always through ideas, sometimes through biology, tightly bound to culture, sometimes through slow absorption, and sometimes through the quiet, brutal arithmetic of inheritance. Because even without war, even without fire, a lineage can disappear simply by not being chosen, by being denied the role of father, by being allowed to live, but not to continue. What vanished in this time was not just genetic variation, it was memory, identity, a map of male kinship that had existed for thousands of years, suddenly redrawn, and it did not return. The lines that replaced it are now the dominant ones. They form the backbone of modern paternal ancestry across much of the continent, and yet they did not rise from within. They arrived from somewhere else. Still, we do not name them. Not yet. The evidence points. The patterns emerge. Burial mounds rise where there were none before. Bits of horses' teeth show wear from bridles. Wheels begin to carve paths into once settled soil. But these are only whispers, not yet voices, and so we leave them, for now, just beyond the edge of certainty. Because what this chapter has shown us is not just a disappearance, it is a threshold. A moment when Europe's past turned sharply inward, when the faces of the future began to look unfamiliar, and when the voices of nearly all its ancient men fell silent, carried away by the wind and the turning of generations. Their memory is not gone, it is buried deep, in forgotten graves, in unsung names, in the faint Y chromosome lineages that survive only as statistical ghosts, and in the question that will carry us forward. What kind of force can erase 9 out of 10 fathers, and leave no story behind? And who, exactly, was left to tell the tale? Across the European landscape, the story begins not with fire, but with fading. Settlements once vibrant with life are found half-finished, half-abandoned. Fields that had been cleared and cultivated return to wild grass. Walls collapse inward. Roof posts rot in place. The signs of departure are subtle but persistent. A spindle whorl left beside a hearth. A grindstone not fully worn down. Animal bones scattered but unbutchered. It is not a battlefield. It is an empty room. Archaeologists call this a cultural horizon, a moment where one way of life disappears from the material record. In the Neolithic heartlands of Europe, this horizon arrives like dusk. In the centuries before the genetic turnover, hundreds of longhouses are vacated, megalithic tombs go unused, ceramics once elaborately decorated become rare or vanish altogether. We find fewer figurines, fewer burials, and in many cases fewer people. But the sky bears no burn marks. The soil holds no ashes. Whatever happened left no scar across the land, and that is what makes it so difficult to explain. Plagues leave graves, wars leave ruins, natural disasters leave a layer of destruction. But in this case, it is as though people simply stopped being there. In Central Europe, regions that had been densely settled for generations fall quiet. Villages that once clustered near rivers and ridgelines disappear from the archaeological map. Their locations are known only because they were excavated centuries later, and even then, it is the absence of later layers, not the presence of new ones, that reveals the story. The tools are still Neolithic. The styles remain local. but the people are gone. We find no signs of trauma in the bones that remain, no defensive walls hastily constructed, no mass burials, no shift in diet that suggests starvation. It is a vanishing without violence, or at least without remembered violence, and it does not affect everyone equally. The maternal lines, as we have seen, continue, so whatever force moved through these regions did not erase life itself. It erased a structure beneath it. It is tempting to look for one answer, a plague, a climate event, an invasion. But the pattern does not support a single cause. The collapse happens in some places earlier, in others later. In some valleys, the record continues almost undisturbed. In others, it ends abruptly. What we are left with is not a smoking gun, but a silence shaped like a question. Something happened to these communities, and whatever it was, it moved in waves. It left tools untouched, homes unsacked, and yet somehow the story ended. And in that ending, a space was made for something else to arrive. This is where the record becomes stranger, and the questions more precise. Because absence alone does not tell a story. Something, or someone, must follow. And what does arrive in time are new materials, new graves, new artifacts that do not quite match what came before. The difference is not always dramatic. It is not a sweeping replacement of one culture by another. It is quieter than that, a new rhythm, a new pattern of life, and underneath it all a new set of fathers, in the layers that follow the abandonment of Neolithic sites. Archaeologists begin to notice a shift. Burial practices change. Bodies are no longer arranged in tight communal tombs. Instead, single graves begin to appear, sometimes covered by earth mounds, sometimes marked by no monument at all. But within those graves something has changed. The goods buried with the dead are different. Weapons appear more often, and overwhelmingly they are buried with men. This new burial pattern is not only about ritual, it reflects something deeper, a shift in identity. In older Neolithic burials, social memory was collective. Graves served entire villages, entire lineages. But now, memory is becoming individualized. The dead man stands alone. His tools, his animals, his ornaments, his weapons, these define him. And through that image, his lineage is reinforced. The role of the individual male becomes central. At the same time, long-distance exchange networks begin to emerge. Materials not native to the region, copper, amber, seashells, gold, appear more frequently in graves, and they are not evenly distributed. Some individuals are clearly richer in death than others. A new hierarchy is forming, a new kind of power, and with it, new patterns of exclusion. But this still does not answer the central question. What happened to the earlier men? If this is a replacement, where is the evidence of conflict? If it was disease, why did the women survive? And if it was migration, why is the material culture not more abruptly different? This is where genetics offers a clarity that archaeology cannot. In region after region, the maternal lines remain steady. The same mitochondrial DNA continues across the transition. But the Y chromosome lines are replaced. The women stayed. The children were born, but the fathers changed. What we begin to see then is a cultural transformation that does not rely on destruction. It relies on systems. Systems that determine who fathers children, systems that limit who holds land, systems that favour certain males and quietly erase others, not through bloodshed, but through lineage. The villages that vanished may not have burned, their people may not have been slaughtered, but the line of inheritance changed, and with it, the memory of one kind of man began to disappear. This is a difficult thing to see with the naked eye. There is no inscription that says who could father children. There is no surviving document that outlines the rules of descent, but the genetic patterns tell us that something altered the flow of ancestry. And the archaeological record, when read carefully, begins to hint at the same transformation. In earlier Neolithic societies, lineage likely passed through both men and women. Families were organised around shared ancestry, shared land, shared labour. Many scholars believe that these communities may have had more egalitarian structures, not without hierarchy, but without rigid dominance. Status was tied to age, to community memory, to ritual knowledge. But after the disappearance of the earlier villages, new settlement patterns appear. Smaller, more mobile groups. Signs of animal herding increase. cattle bones rise in frequency. Wheels and wagons enter the scene, and with this shift comes a likely change in how society was structured. The household becomes more patriarchal. Power begins to concentrate, not among elders of a village, but among certain male lines. What happens in these centuries may be a kind of silent revolution, one where dominance is not declared, but enacted through the slow narrowing of who gets to belong. Marriage alliances shift. Property begins to be inherited through the male line. The right to raise children becomes linked not to community, but to control. And once a group gains that control, especially over reproduction, they do not need to outnumber the rest. They only need to outlast them. Across just a few generations, the genetic legacy of other men fades, not because they died in battle, not because they were driven out, but because their children were not counted as theirs, or were never born. This is why the disappearance is so difficult to detect. It unfolds not through war, but through structure, through a reshaping of who is visible, of whose sons inherit the name, of whose line is remembered in the body of the future, and still this story remains unfinished. Because the question of who arrived and how has not yet been answered. We see the results, we trace the genes, we follow the shadows of new customs and new graves, but the people themselves are still unnamed. Their language is not recorded, their rituals are not written down, they exist only in what they left behind. And yet, those remnants are starting to speak. In the bones of horses, in the edges of copper blades, in the quiet logic of replacement that follows wherever they went. These clues do not shout, they do not tell us everything. But they gather, slowly, across the landscape, like footprints left after the grass has sprung back. In the western steppes of Eurasia, signs begin to appear of a mobile people. They leave behind barrows called kurgans. Their graves are wide and deep. Their skeletons often rest with stone battle axes, wheeled carts and animal remains. Horses feature more frequently now, not just as food, but as companions. A partnership begins to take form, between human and animal, speed and distance, presence and reach. And yet, we are still far from the European heartlands. These steppe cultures lived far to the east of the Neolithic villages that were now falling silent. But in the centuries that follow, the archaeological record shows a slow westward motion. The horizon begins to shift. The tools change. The burials change. The genes change. This movement does not come as a storm. It comes like a tide, gradual, repetitive, but impossible to reverse. In places where Neolithic settlements had once stood, new sites begin to appear with different material cultures. The pottery is simpler, the grave goods more weaponized, the bones taller, more robust, and the Y chromosome lines, the paternal markers, are different. This is the key. The maternal line remains. But the fathers, in growing numbers, carry the genetic signatures traced to the eastern plains. It is this pattern, replacement of male ancestry with continuity of female ancestry, that defines the mystery. And in the archaeological record, we begin to see how this transformation may have occurred. Not through cities or siege engines, not through state armies, but through something older, perhaps even more effective: pastoralism, mobility, and social systems built on male lineage dominance. Some researchers suggest that in these incoming groups, reproduction was tightly linked to status and kinship. Male elites could produce many children, lower-ranking males fewer. This skew in reproductive success over time can erase other lineages, even without physical violence. And when this structure meets a population more evenly distributed, the result is not balance, it is absorption. Still, the change is not only genetic, it is cultural, it is ecological. The landscapes change too. Forests are cleared to make space for pasture. Trade routes emerge where none had existed. River valleys that once fed wheat fields now serve as corridors for herds. What is arriving is not just a people, but a worldview, a way of moving, a way of measuring worth, and a new idea of legacy, built not on shared land, but on bloodlines that expand through dominance. The men who once tended these fields may have remained for a while, but they did not remain in memory. Their tools remain buried, their names do not. In the archaeological record, this is the final silence. Not destruction, but displacement. Not extinction, but invisibility. What we are witnessing is not the end of a people, but the end of their line, a quiet rewriting of ancestry, a narrowing of memory that passes not through war but through inheritance. And still the land remembers. A field that was once farmed leaves traces in the pollen. A house that once stood leaves shadows in the soil. A broken pot, a woven thread, a child's footprint pressed into clay, these are the fragments that remain. But the voices behind them are no longer present in the lineages that followed. In some places the transition may have felt slow. Fathers watched their daughters marry strangers. Sons worked the same land but answered to new hierarchies. Rituals shifted, old gods faded, languages changed. But over time, a new pattern took hold, one that would become dominant not only in the genes, but in the structure of European societies for millennia, and perhaps most haunting of all, the shift was not noticed at the time. No one alive then would have spoken of a collapse. The children were still born, the crops still grew, the seasons still turned. But beneath that continuity, the axis of inheritance had changed, and when the change was complete, the old paternal lines were gone. Modern genetics allows us to see this with a clarity unavailable to those who lived through it. We can trace the chromosome maps, we can date the spread of lineages, we can pinpoint when the last echoes of the earlier fathers fade from the record, but we still do not fully know what it felt like, to witness that change, or to live unaware beneath its slow unravelling. What we do know is this: the collapse of male lineages did not happen in isolation. It unfolded alongside a broader transformation of landscapes, of economies, of kinship systems. It was not a simple replacement, but a reordering of who mattered, of who belonged, and of who would be remembered. This is why the vanished villages matter. They are not just ruins, they are absences that mark a moment of deep rearrangement, not just in tools or rituals, but in who was allowed to shape the generations to come. The cause is still unnamed, the arrival still unannounced, but the impact is visible now, in the maps of ancestry, in the patterns of power, and in the strange fact that so much could change, while the world above seemed unchanged. And so we turn to the horizon again. Something new is coming into focus, and with it, the first outlines of those who stepped into the silence. They did not come with cities. They did not build walls. Their memory lives not in temples, but in mounds of earth and circles of stone. To understand who they were, we must leave the forests and rivers of Neolithic Europe behind. We must look east, to the windswept grasslands between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a land with no horizon, only sky. The Pontic Caspian steppe. It is here, 5,000 years ago, that a different rhythm of life begins to take form, one not rooted in villages but in motion, not in planting but in herding, not in permanence but in cycles of pasture, of animal growth, of seasonal return. These people lived with their herds, cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. Their economy moved with them, and so did their homes. Archaeologists call this the Yamnaya horizon. Named after a word meaning pit grave, it refers to a culture that buried their dead beneath low earthen mounds, marked by shallow pits and covered with stone slabs. But the graves are only part of the story. What defines this culture is not what they left in the ground. It is how they moved across it. The Yamnaya were pastoralists. Their lives were shaped by the needs of their herds. They migrated along predictable routes, seeking fresh grazing lands in winter and summer, but they were not aimless. Their migrations followed paths known to generations: water sources, safe crossings, sheltered valleys. Over time, these became cultural corridors, not marked by monuments, but by memory. Their homes were not houses, but wagons, covered, wheeled, and mobile. Entire households could be moved in a day. Children were born beside riverbanks and raised in the shelter of the steppe. Tools, weapons, and ornaments were carried from place to place, and with every journey, a message was carried too. These were not people tied to place. They were people tied to each other, to kin, to herd, to root. The steppe was not an easy teacher. Winters were brutal, summers dry. Resources had to be tracked, rationed, defended. Communities had to cooperate to survive, but also compete for the best land. This fostered a kind of resilience, not just physical, but social. Groups needed strong coordination. They needed leaders who could guide movement. negotiate conflict, organise labour. And perhaps most importantly, they needed systems that could carry identity across distance. In this open world, lineage mattered. Who your father was shaped, who you were. The bonds of kinship had to endure across hundreds of miles, and so they were reinforced through ritual, through myth, and through burial, and in time, through something else. The mound, the kurgan, a signal to the sky that this place for now belonged to someone. The kurgan was more than a grave. It was a marker of presence, a claim not just to land, but to memory. Inside these low mounds, a man was buried, often with his weapons, his ornaments, and sometimes his animals. His body was usually placed on his back, knees raised, face to the sky. Around him might lie offerings, and in some cases others, relatives, servants, or followers whose roles are still debated. The kurgan stood where no wall was needed. Its message was simple. Someone lived here, someone died here, and someone else remembers. In the wide openness of the steppe, where permanence was rare, this was a kind of anchor, a fixed point in a world of motion, and each new mound added another thread to a growing network of remembrance. From the Carpathians to the Volga, the landscape became dotted with these low hills of earth and bone. But while the dead were buried, the living moved. The Yamnaya household was not a nuclear family in the modern sense. It was a mobile economic unit, multi-generational, complex, and often hierarchical. At its centre was a male lineage. Fathers, sons, uncles, grandfathers. Around them, the domestic sphere, women, children, extended kin, worked to maintain the animals, the shelter, and the seasonal rhythms that survival required. This structure made the Yamnaya uniquely suited for expansion. Each household could replicate itself. Each male line could carry identity forward. And because they were not tied to one village or one plot of land, they could respond quickly to opportunity, to open pasture, to weakening neighbours, to favourable conditions. Mobility was power, and in time, this power began to stretch westward. There is no single moment when the Yamnaya arrived in Europe. The process was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was a flow, sometimes gradual, sometimes sharp. Archaeologists track it through changes in burial practice, in pottery and skeletal traits. Geneticists track it even more clearly, in the sudden rise of Y chromosome haplogroups R1a and R1b. These paternal lines, barely present before, begin to dominate the genetic landscape. The spread was not uniform. In some areas, Yamnaya presence was partial, in others it became total. But across much of the continent, especially between 3000 and 2500 BCE, the pattern repeats. The earlier male lineages vanish, the new ones take root, and in their wake, the steppe way of life begins to reshape the cultural map. But this reshaping was not just about genes or graves, it was about how people moved, how they formed identity, and how they organised power, not through walls or titles, but through kinship lines that stretched across the grasslands, and through memory encoded in earth. These kurgans were not just graves, they were anchors in time. Unlike the communal tombs of earlier farmers, which honoured lineages stretching backward, the Yamnaya barrows looked forward. They marked a claim. They planted a man into the soil and with him, a legacy. His body remained beneath the mound, but his name, if he had one, lived through his sons. Each kurgan was a signal. To strangers it said this place is held. To kin it said this name still matters. To rivals it said we remember our dead and we will return. And they did return. Many kurgans show signs of reuse. A new body added generations later, offerings refreshed, the dead revisited. This suggests a kind of ritual loop, a way of tying present action to ancestral presence. Even in motion, memory could be fixed. This structure mattered. It gave shape to mobility. It provided meaning to movement. The Yamnaya did not wander. They cycled. They returned. And in their circuits they created a web of seasonal power, one not marked on maps, but known by paths, stories, and bones. What made this system powerful was not its size, but its logic. It scaled easily. A household could split. A lineage could branch. A successful male could produce many children, and as those children moved outward, they carried his Y chromosome, his signature, with them. The system rewarded expansion. It rewarded reproduction, and it remembered only those who succeeded. The women in these groups also mattered deeply, but genetically their story is harder to track. Mitochondrial DNA shows continuity across time. It is the Y chromosome that changed. This tells us something about the structure of replacement. It was not about annihilation. It was about substitution. A new set of men took up space. They married local women. Their sons carried forward the new identity. And within a few generations, the earlier paternal lines were gone. This is not just biology. It is sociology. It is demography. It is structure. In a mobile world, social cohesion depends on shared identity. But when groups expand into new territory, they need more than memory. They need symbols. They need systems that say who belongs. The kurgan was one such system. So were the grave goods, the body positions, the cattle rituals. These marked affiliation. They marked descent. And in doing so, they made it easier for a group to spread without losing itself. The Yamnaya did not build cities. They did not write. But they built continuity. They built it in the flesh of their children, in the tracks of their wagons, and in the low hills of their dead. And from these, a world began to grow, one that would not only expand, but transform. The transformation did not happen through sudden conquest. There are few signs of a large-scale destruction in the archaeological record. Instead, the change came through integration, through the steady repetition of a way of life that favoured certain men, certain lineages, and certain structures. Over time, these structures took root far beyond the steppe. From the Dniester to the Danube, kurgans appear where they had not before. Burial practices shift. New kinds of pottery emerge, often undecorated, practical and durable, designed for movement, not display. Stone battle axes spread, found now in places once dominated by polished farming tools. And with these changes comes a new demographic signature: taller skeletons, different facial structures, and above all a sharp rise in paternal haplogroups traced to the eastern steppe. But the most important transformation is not in the objects, it is in the logic beneath them. What spreads is not just material culture, it is a way of organising life and death. At the heart of the Yamnaya system is the principle of expansion through lineage. A successful male could father many children. His descendants could branch off and found new households. These new households in turn could reproduce the system, not just biologically but socially. This created a cascading effect. Each generation widened the footprint, each movement planted the structure elsewhere. The steppe offered the training ground for this. It taught people how to survive through adaptation, how to read the land, how to rely on kin. But once this structure touched the softer soils of Neolithic Europe, it accelerated. The mobile household met the settled village, and in many places it replaced it. This replacement did not always mean destruction. In many regions, the genetic and cultural record suggest admixture. Local women joined incoming groups. Children were born with one foot in each world. But over time, the paternal line of the newcomers became dominant. Their customs began to frame the new identity. This is why the collapse of earlier male lines seemed so sudden. It did not require a single violent moment. It only required a system that rewarded certain men with more descendants, and that continued across generations. The kurgans marked this change, but they were only the surface. Beneath them was a deeper structure, one built on mobility, hierarchy and memory. And as the kurgans multiplied across the continent, so did the logic they represented. The Yamnaya carried more than wagons. They carried a blueprint, not written in ink, but in custom, in ritual, in genes. And that blueprint, once set in motion, proved difficult to stop. It did not just fill empty spaces, it replaced what had been there, and it left only the quiet echo of what was lost. What remains today are the outlines. The wheel ruts now vanished from the grass, the bones beneath the barrows. The echoes of a language not yet spoken, but already on the wind. We do not yet know what these early Yamnaya herders called themselves. Their names are not preserved, their words are not written down, but their presence is unmistakable. It runs through the soil, the genes, the rhythms of ancestry that ripple into the present. In their world, distance was not a barrier. It was a medium. Movement was not escape. It was structure, and the line of a father to his sons was not just a private matter. It was the pillar of identity. When their households moved westward, they did not bring empires. They brought reproduction, repetition, memory. The Kurgans remind us of this. Hundreds of thousands still remain scattered across the steppe and beyond, each one a low, rounded signal. Here lies someone who mattered. Here lies someone remembered. But those who were replaced, the men of the earlier villages, left no such mounds. They were not buried with weapons. They were not entombed in stone. Their names did not ride across the horizon, and so their memory too became untethered, not erased in a single moment, but unwound gently, generation by generation, until only fragments remained. This is how the transformation took root, not through conquest carved in stone, but through the steady layering of lineage over lineage, through the placement of a new body in the earth, through the sons who moved onward, through the memory that rode with them. And still, the story is only beginning. Because the Yamnaya were not the end of a mystery, they were the start of a new pattern, one that would continue to shape languages, borders and beliefs across continents. Their arrival marked the turning of the wheel, not just of wagons, but of time. What we see in their rise is not a moment of destruction, but of rearrangement, a quiet reshaping of who would be remembered and who would not. Their horses left no hoofprints we can follow, their homes left no walls we can excavate, but their choices echo still, in the blood of their descendants, in the mounds they built, and in the silence they left behind. And so we follow that silence further west, toward the lands where older fathers vanished, toward the places where memory was overwritten, toward the graves where only one story was allowed to remain. Because what happened next would spread farther than the steppe and deeper than the grave. When the Yamnaya entered Europe, they left few signs the eye could follow. They did not build cities. They did not carve laws into stone. Their languages vanished long before the first alphabets appeared. Yet today, their fingerprints are everywhere, not in the soil, but in us. The discovery began not with archaeology, but with genetics. In the early 2000s, scientists began sequencing the genomes of ancient human remains. At first, the goal was simple: understand the deep ancestry of Europe. But what emerged was unexpected. Beneath the known layers of Neolithic farmers and earlier hunter-gatherers, a third signal appeared. Strong, widespread, and previously invisible. This was the Ghost Tribe. A population that had contributed up to half the genetic ancestry of many European groups, yet had left almost no direct archaeological identity in those regions. They had not simply influenced, they had transformed. In places like Britain, Germany and Scandinavia, this signal was especially strong. In some areas, more than 70% of the male ancestry could be traced to the steppe. What made this discovery so powerful was how it shifted the timeline. The old model of slow internal change no longer fit. Instead, something abrupt had happened. A movement of people, a reshaping of genes, a replacement of fathers, and yet, until the genome revealed it, no one had seen them coming. The Yamnaya had entered Europe not with banners, but with wagons, not with fire, but with fertility. And once there, they merged with local groups, spreading not just their DNA, but their way of life. Over time, their identity blended with new cultures, new languages, new tools, new customs, but the core remained. One of the clearest archaeological traces of this fusion appears in the corded ware culture. Named after the distinctive impressions on their pottery, this group spread rapidly across Central and Northern Europe around 2900 BCE. Their burial customs, body types, and male ancestry suggest a heavy steppe influence. They buried individuals in single graves, they used stone battle axes, they practiced mobile pastoralism, and most of all, they carried the Y chromosome haplogroups of the Yamnaya. This was not a copy. It was an adaptation, a culture that took the steppe template and reshaped it to fit a new environment. In some areas, corded ware traditions coexisted with earlier Neolithic customs. In others, they replaced them entirely. And then came another wave, the bell beaker culture. Different pottery, different adornments, but within the same genetic frame. Again, steppe ancestry appears strong. Again the male lines dominate. Again the story repeats. Of fusion, replacement, and the quiet endurance of an invisible legacy. The bell beaker phenomenon, named for its distinctive pottery shaped like an inverted bell spread across much of Western and Central Europe after 2800 BCE. At first glance, it seems different from the corded ware world. The artifacts are new, the burial patterns shift, the ornaments reflect another aesthetic, but under the surface the genes tell a different story. Across Britain, Iberia and the Rhine Valley, bell-beaker individuals carry the same paternal signatures as the Yamnaya and the corded ware before them. The dominant Y chromosome lineages remain, especially R1b, a marker that now forms the most common paternal ancestry in Western Europe. These were not isolated cultural packages, they were linked migrations, transformations of both body and behaviour. In Britain, the change was almost total. Within just a few centuries, the Neolithic male lineages disappear. Nearly all later males descend from newcomers associated with the Beaker horizon. The continuity of local maternal lines suggested mixture, not annihilation. But again, the fathers were replaced. This process, repeated across regions, made the Yamnaya legacy harder to see. Their burial mounds gave way to other styles. Their wagons no longer rolled across the landscape. Their language shifted into new dialects. Their customs dissolved into the blended societies that followed. What remained was not a name, but a direction, a pattern, a hidden architecture of ancestry and organisation that outlived the surface culture. This is why the Yamnaya story stayed invisible for so long. Archaeologists had found the artefacts, they had mapped the pottery styles, but the people themselves, their origins, their scale of impact, remained obscured. Without ancient DNA, there was no way to trace the bloodlines beneath the tools, no way to see the demographic tides behind the cultural change. And so, for decades, prehistory told a gentler story, a gradual diffusion of ideas, farmers trading knowledge with foragers, cultures blending over long arcs of time, and in some places this may have been true. But the genetic record reveals something more sudden, a shift not just in pottery, but in paternity, not just in customs, but in chromosomes. The Yamnaya did not vanish, they multiplied, but their memory fragmented. Absorbed into the corded ware and bell-beaker identities, drowned in new symbols, rewritten by the next generation. The men who set the wheel in motion became part of a new world that no longer carried their name, but carried their blood. And that blood continued to spread, not as an empire, not as a nation, but as a quiet map drawn in bone, a signal so faint that only now, thousands of years later, can we begin to read it. A signal so faint that only now, thousands of years later, can we begin to read it. The rise of genetic science has rewritten much of what we thought we knew about prehistory. Not by replacing the archaeological record, but by adding depth to its shadows. It allows us to see what the stones could not tell, who fathered whom, where bloodlines ended, where they began again under a different name. This is how the Yamnaya reappeared, not as conquerors carved into memory, but as statistical patterns in the bones of the dead. Their legacy had been hiding in plain sight, woven into the genomes of the living, resting beneath the fields of Central Europe, whispering from the skeletons of men buried 5,000 years ago, who carried lineages still found in millions today. Yet for all their genetic presence, the Yamnaya left few stories, no myths that name them. No oral traditions that preserve their migrations, even the Indo-European languages, which many scholars now link in part to steppe expansion, give no certain origin. The trail fades into reconstructed roots, protoforms, guessed meanings. This silence is what makes them a ghost tribe. They reshaped the genetic future of Europe, and yet they were never remembered as a people, not in legend, not in lineage, not in name. And perhaps that is part of their power, because when history forgets a people but carries their inheritance forward, something strange happens. The past becomes embedded but not visible. The structures remain, but the story does not. The Yamnaya vanished into the cultures they helped shape, into the grave fields of corded ware farmers, into the ornaments of bell-beaker craftsmen, into the bones of children whose fathers had crossed from east to west, leaving their own fathers buried beneath the grass. Today, many people in Europe carry Y chromosomes that trace directly back to the Yamnaya expansion. In some regions, nearly all paternal ancestry flows through that single corridor. Yet until recently, No one knew the corridor existed. This is the scale of the transformation. It was not just a migration, it was a turning of the genealogical wheel. A narrowing of lines, a redirection of descent. What happened was not visible on the surface, but its results reshaped the future. We now know that much of the male ancestry in Europe descends from a group that did not build cities, that did not write, that did not leave behind their own voice. They lived by motion, they lived by kin, and they lived in a world where memory was carried not by stories, but by sons. That is how they remained unseen for so long. They left no names to remember, only lineages that endured, and because of this, the Yamnaya became something rare in human history, a people who reshaped the world, yet slipped entirely from its memory. We know of empires that rose and fell. We remember kings, priests and builders, but the Yamnaya left no dynasty, no monument, no written law, only a footprint in blood. This invisibility reshapes how we think about power. It was not broadcast. It was not written down. It was passed through the body, through sons who carried their father's chromosomes westward, silently replacing the men who had come before. Their daughters also lived, their mothers endured, but it is in the male line that we see the sharpest rupture. Because the Y chromosome is so specific, passed only from father to son, its changes are unambiguous. It tells us when a group disappeared. It tells us who replaced them. It cannot lie. And so, with each new ancient genome sequenced, the map becomes clearer, a wave of ancestry, moving steadily from the eastern steppe across the continent. Not always violent, not always fast, but unmistakable. At first, this discovery caused confusion. The archaeological layers did not show widespread destruction. There were no ashes, no ruins, no mass graves. But the DNA told a different story, one of overwhelming replacement in certain regions. This forced scientists to re-examine everything. If such a large demographic shift could leave so few visible traces, what else had been missed? Slowly, a new framework emerged, one in which mobility, social structure, and reproduction mattered as much as weapons. One in which cultural systems could rewrite the future without leaving clear marks on the present. One in which a people like the Yamnaya could arrive, integrate, and dominate, not through the sword, but through sons. This kind of legacy is hard to see. It does not carve itself into stone. It does not announce itself in legend. It moves like a root system underground. Quiet. Persistent, spreading far from its source, and that is what happened. The Yamnaya ancestry did not stay on the steppe. It followed the cattle. It followed the daughters of other cultures. It moved through corded ware households. It flowed through bell beaker migrations. And from there, it entered the bones of Bronze Age kings, Iron Age warriors, and modern men. They are remembered not by name, but by presence, by the code they left behind in bodies, by the structure they left behind in societies, by the silences they left behind in memory. And even now, that presence remains, in the shape of certain jawlines, in the sound of certain languages, in the logic of certain hierarchies. But for thousands of years, no one knew where it came from. It took the silent work of ancient bones to speak. It took the quiet code inside our cells to point backward. And when it did, the path led not to a forgotten city or a broken temple, but to the open steppe, to people without walls, without writing, without a monument to mark their rise. And yet their rise changed everything. The story of the Yamnaya is not about heroes. It is not about conquest in the way we imagine. It is about a structure, a way of life that rewarded mobility, a social system that favoured certain men, a pattern that could spread because it did not need buildings or borders. What they left behind was not a culture that could be dug up whole. It was fragments, a burial here, a genetic marker there, pieces scattered across a continent, pieces that only recently began to fall into place, and when they did, they revealed a ghost, not a single people, but a pulse, a rhythm that reshaped Europe from within. Today, that rhythm lives in many of us, in the Y chromosomes that echo a migration 5,000 years old, in the family trees that branch quietly eastward, in the very languages we use to ask where we come from. For a long time, we thought of history as something told in stories, but some stories are not written in words, They are written in bloodlines, and they speak not in sentences, but in structure. The Yamnaya were never remembered in myth, but they are part of the reason the myths exist. They moved through Europe like wind moves across grass. Leaving little behind that could be touched, but changing the shape of the landscape all the same, and so we name them now not because they asked to be remembered, but because their absence left a question. Who were these people who rewrote the future and left no record of doing so? Their story is not finished. It is still being uncovered, layer by layer, genome by genome. It is not a tale of villains and victims, it is a tale of patterns, of how the structure of kinship can reshape a continent, of how memory can vanish and still leave a mark. In the next chapter, we follow that mark. Because the ghost tribe did not simply pass through. They settled, they merged, and in time they built something new, a hybrid world where the past was rearranged, and where nearly all of Europe would come to carry their shadow. But the shadow did not fall evenly. There is a difference in the way it touched the women and the men, because the replacement was not total, it was precise, and it followed a pattern found in no myth, but in the math of inheritance itself. The male line changed, the female line did not. Across nearly every region where steppe ancestry spread, researchers noticed the same thing, a dramatic surge in Yamnaya-linked Y chromosomes, and at the same time a quiet continuity in the mitochondrial DNA passed from mothers to children. This is one of the most striking patterns in the ancient genome record. In some areas, the proportion of steppe-related Y chromosomes reaches above 90%, yet the maternal lines remain tied to earlier Neolithic populations. These were not complete population replacements, they were targeted, and the target was the fathers. So what does that mean? The simplest reading is also the most difficult. That Yamnaya males integrated into local societies, or absorbed them, in ways that privileged their own reproductive lines. That local men were somehow excluded, that the sons born in the generations that followed carried the blood of incoming fathers and the memory of native mothers. This is not a unique event in human history. It has happened in other times, other places, often in the context of conquest or colonization, but here it leaves no epic poems, no stone records, only the structure of ancestry as proof. The numbers are stark. In Britain, by the time bell beaker culture takes hold, nearly all paternal ancestry derives from steppe sources, but many of the maternal lines stretch further back, to the farmers of southern Europe, and even to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Similar patterns show up in Central Europe, the Balkans and the Iberian Peninsula. Again and again, the female lines remain. The male lines do not. This raises questions that no genome can fully answer. How did these changes happen? Was it peaceful absorption? Was it systemic exclusion? Was it shaped by marriage alliances or by force? We do not know. What we do know is this. The inheritance of ancestry does not always align with the inheritance of culture. And when change happens unevenly between men and women, it reshapes more than just the genome. It reshapes the story. It shifts the weight of memory. Because even when everything changes, the women remained. The persistence of maternal lines is more than a technical detail. It is a window into how societies absorbed change. When we follow mitochondrial DNA across Europe, we see continuity that stretches back thousands of years before the steppe expansions. The same maternal haplogroups carried by Neolithic farmers appear again in Bronze Age burials. They survived the upheaval of paternal replacement. This means that women from local populations were still present. They bore children, they raised families, they carried traditions. But the men who once stood beside them were no longer represented in the lineages that followed. In archaeology, this has profound implications. It suggests that cultural change was not as simple as one people pushing another aside. Instead, what unfolded was more complex. It was integration, but integration on unequal terms. The genetic record shows that male ancestry shifted dramatically, while female ancestry stayed steady. That imbalance speaks of a society where reproductive power was concentrated, where certain men controlled not just herds or weapons, but access to family itself. This kind of asymmetry can arise in many ways. It can come from conquest, where incoming groups take local women as wives and partners. It can come from arranged alliances, where communities absorb outsiders through marriage. or it can come from structures that systematically favour one group of men over another. In every case, the result is the same. Some fathers are remembered, others fade away. The silence of the male lineages is striking because it is so absolute. In some regions, more than 90% of earlier Y chromosomes vanish. This is not random drift. It is replacement on a massive scale. And yet, without genetics, it would have been invisible. The houses of the Neolithic still stood for a while. The tools still worked. The fields were still farmed. But the fathers of those fields no longer carried the same blood forward. Meanwhile, the voices of the women carried across the generations. Their mitochondrial DNA is steady, a thread that endures through upheaval. This suggests resilience, but also continuity. The women connected the old world to the new. Their presence bridged the rupture, even when the identity of the men shifted. This continuity complicates the picture. It means that the Yamnaya story is not one of total destruction. It is not a tale of one group erasing another from existence. It is a story of selective inheritance, a narrowing of who could claim descent on the paternal side, a survival of those who carried descent on the maternal side. Together, these forces shaped the genetic foundation of Europe, and in that foundation, the women remained. Their presence makes the story more human, because when we speak of vanished lineages, it can sound like an abstract shift, a pattern on a chart. But behind those patterns were lives, women whose ancestors had farmed the land for centuries, women who carried songs, rituals, and ways of working that did not vanish even when the fathers did. This continuity may help explain why the Neolithic did not disappear in one stroke. Farming continued. Pottery traditions lingered. Settlements remained occupied even as new elements entered. The women embodied the persistence of that world. They passed knowledge to their children. They carried language, at least for a while. They connected the newcomers to local resources, local skills, local traditions. Without them, the transition might have been far more abrupt. But continuity is not the same as equality. The genetic asymmetry shows that women were incorporated but on unequal terms. They were absorbed into a social system that prioritized the lineage of incoming men. This tells us something about the structure of those societies. They were patriarchal in a way earlier farming communities may not have been. Power and memory were vested in fathers. Descent was traced through the male line, and this left little room for the older local men to survive in the record. The result is a paradox. The women preserved the past, yet at the same time they carried it into a future shaped by others. Their children were no longer Neolithic in identity. They were the offspring of a new fusion, carrying both old maternal genes and new paternal ones. Over generations, the maternal contribution became absorbed into the Steppe framework. The women endured, but the societies that formed were not their own. This is why the story of the women matters. It softens the idea of replacement, but it does not erase the asymmetry. It shows how the transformation of Europe was not total annihilation, but selective survival, a survival that privileged certain men, but still relied on the presence of women from the communities that came before. Archaeological evidence supports this. In many regions, we find hybrid cultures emerging, pottery styles that blend corded ware with local designs, settlements that show both steppe and farming traditions. These are traces of fusion, the fingerprints of families that joined across cultural lines. And within those families, the women's role is clear. They were the ones who bridged the two worlds. They were the ones who ensured that not everything was lost when the paternal lines were replaced. The maternal thread is quiet, but it is strong. It ties us back to a time before the upheaval. It reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming change, survival is not only about conquest, it is also about endurance, and through that endurance, the women remained. What they carried forward was more than DNA. It was memory, embedded not in books or monuments, but in gestures, in food, in lullabies passed from mother to child. These kinds of knowledge do not fossilize. They do not show up in layers of soil, but they shape a people, and through them, the world before the Yamnaya did not vanish completely. It transformed. The children of these women belonged to something new. Their fathers came from a different world, one of herders, of open steppes, of mobile wealth measured in cattle. But their mothers came from the land itself, from the old villages, from the rooted lives of Neolithic farming. In this way, the transition was not a clean break, it was a fusion, and the fusion did not happen in stone circles or across battle lines. It happened in households, in births, in the quiet rituals of daily life. This helps explain how such a massive demographic shift left so few archaeological scars. The women ensured continuity. They carried forward the rhythms of life even as those rhythms were repatterned around them. In some cases, their voices were likely silenced. In others, they may have adapted. Either way, their presence bridged the rupture. And yet the structure they entered was not symmetrical. Yamnaya society appears to have been deeply patriarchal. Their burial customs show strong emphasis on male lineage. Their social organisation favoured extended families bound by the male line. Their movement across Europe carried this system with them, a system that centralised reproduction through selected men and expanded rapidly by forming new kin-based units. The result was a genetic pattern that looks less like a melting pot and more like a funnel, wide maternal variety entering into a narrowing corridor of paternal ancestry. This is the legacy of that structure. It also means that when we trace our ancestry, we must be careful with what we call origin. Many modern Europeans carry maternal lines that reach back to Neolithic farmers or Mesolithic foragers. But those same individuals often carry paternal lines that entered with the steppe. In their bodies is the story of replacement and persistence, interwoven. This duality matters, because it complicates the idea of identity. It means that those who survived did so not by remaining the same, but by becoming something else. And those who arrived did not do so alone. They merged, not equally, not always peacefully, but deeply. That merging shaped the genetic structure of modern Europe, and it left behind a model of social change that still echoes. One where the women remained, but in doing so, helped give rise to a world that no longer looked like their own. The past was not erased, but it was rewritten, and the women's names, like the men's, are lost. But their legacy flows through us still, quiet, unbroken, enduring. In many ways, that is the legacy of the women whose names we will never know. They did not build empires, they did not carve monuments, but their genetic presence, their cultural resilience, their role in the survival and reshaping of human history, it is undeniable. What we see in the archaeological and genetic record is not just a map of movement, it is a map of structure. Who was allowed to remain? Who was chosen to reproduce? Who shaped the generations to come? And in that structure, the women provided continuity through disruption. The Yamnaya expansion rewrote the paternal line, but it relied on maternal presence. Without the women, there would have been no bridge, no integration, no children. The newcomers would have been invaders. Instead, they became ancestors. This invites a more careful reading of the past, one that does not flatten history into winners and losers, one that recognises the layered way cultures change. The truth is not that one group replaced another entirely. The truth is that some people disappeared from the line of descent while others were woven into it. Some voices fell silent, others whispered forward. The survival of maternal lines is not just a genetic fact, it is a clue to the emotional structure of ancient life. It suggests relationships that crossed cultural boundaries. It suggests adaptation. And it reminds us that even in moments of great upheaval, connection was possible. Not always equal, not always fair, but possible. It also helps us understand why so much of this transformation remained invisible for so long. The women carried memory, but it was not the kind that left tools or weapons or grand architecture. It was the kind that passed quietly through households. It lived in stories never written down. It moved forward one child at a time. That movement shaped the continent. It shaped who we are. Because even now, when we trace our maternal ancestry, when we look at the mitochondrial threads that link us to the past, many of those threads reach back through this time. Through the daughters of Europe who lived through the disappearance of their brothers and fathers, through the women who bore children with men from the steppe, through the lives that refused to vanish. Their world changed, and so did they. But their presence was never erased. We carry it still, and in doing so, we inherit a more complex story. One not just of conquest or collapse, but of survival through transformation. A story shaped as much by those who endured as by those who arrived. In the next chapter, we turn to the deeper question behind this change. Not just who lived or died, but who decided, and what systems of power made it so. Because behind those systems stood bodies, human forms shaped by wind and scarcity and motion. The Yamnaya did not simply bring new genes, they brought new bodies, new minds, new burdens. They were not only different in culture, they were different in kind. The steppe forged them. It is a land that does not forgive softness. Winters bite deep, summers crack the soil. There are no forests to hide in, no mountains to trap rain. It is an open world where survival favours strength, endurance, and attention to change. And the people who thrived there carried those qualities in their bones. Compared to the Neolithic farmers of Europe, the Yamnaya were larger, taller, denser in muscle and frame. Their diet was higher in animal protein and fat. They drank milk into adulthood, something earlier populations could not do. The gene for lactose persistence, which allows adults to digest dairy, appears in high frequency among steppe groups. It gave them a nutritional edge, a way to extract energy from herds not just by meat, but by milk. This was not trivial. In a mobile society where food security depended on livestock, the ability to digest milk year-round meant survival through lean seasons. It meant fewer interruptions in energy supply. It meant resilience through migration and drought. And so the trait spread, not just culturally but biologically. It gave them strength, but it came at a cost. Populations adapted to the steppe also show higher rates of genes linked to inflammatory responses. In modern contexts, these are associated with autoimmune conditions, diseases where the body's defences turn inward. These adaptations may once have helped resist infections or recover from wounds, but they also left behind a legacy of overactive immune systems. The steppe is not gentle. Its people could not afford to be either. But the adaptations went deeper than the immune system. The Yamnaya were not only shaped by what they ate, they were shaped by how they thought. Researchers have identified steppe-related gene clusters tied to neurological traits, not specific behaviours, but tendencies toward vigilance, toward pattern-seeking, toward endurance under stress. These traits are not easily measured in ancient individuals, but in large population studies, they echo across groups with steppe ancestry. These traits are not inherently good or bad. They're trade-offs. What aids survival in one context may bring difficulty in another. Sensitivity to threat can mean hypervigilance. Pattern-seeking can shade into obsession. Resilience under stress can become emotional suppression. These traits are tools. And like all tools, they reflect the environment in which they were shaped. This does not mean the Yamnaya were better or worse. It means they were adapted. In the same way a desert fox is adapted to heat. In the same way a polar bear is adapted to ice. They came from a world that required a certain kind of resilience, and that resilience became part of the human story. When they entered Europe, they brought those adaptations with them, not only in genes, but in rhythm, in worldview, in how they raised children and handled threat, in how they survived, and in what they passed on, Because when we speak of genes, we are not only speaking of physical traits, we are speaking of dispositions, of subtle tendencies that, over time, shape how groups respond to stress, change, and one another. The Yamnaya way of life was not built around stability. It was built around movement. Cattle herding across open land required more than strength. It demanded attention, vigilance, a mind attuned to risk and opportunity, to patterns in the weather, to shifts in herd behaviour, to signals in the grass that might mean danger was near. These were not luxuries, they were necessities, and in that necessity selection did its work. This does not mean every individual thought the same. It means that, across generations, those who could thrive in the rhythm of that life were more likely to pass on their traits, and those traits included more than muscle. They included cognitive style. Anthropologists have long noted that societies built around mobility tend to emphasize autonomy, quick decision-making, and flexible social structures. The Yamnaya likely carried these values, not as ideology but as habit. Life on the steppe required them, and when they moved into Europe they did not leave those habits behind. This is where biology and culture blur. Because a people adapted to wide open spaces, to danger without walls, will organise themselves differently than a people shaped by settled farming. They will value speed, risk tolerance, defence through kin bonds rather than permanent walls, and they will seek to reshape the world in ways that match those instincts. This may help explain why the genetic replacement was so rapid. The Yamnaya were not just a group with stronger bodies or sharper weapons. They may have been carrying a social logic that outcompeted slower systems, one that spread because it adapted faster. It also may explain why the change was not symmetrical. If the Yamnaya system favoured male line inheritance, then only certain men could become ancestors. Others were left behind, not through war alone, but through exclusion, through systems that rewarded aggression or alliance and filtered out those who could not compete. Over time, this would leave a mark, not just on the genome, but on the shape of society. And yet, this pattern is still unfolding, because many of the traits linked to steppe ancestry continue into the present. Some are praised, others are pathologized, but all are inherited. They were not selected for modern life. They were selected for motion, hardship, and uncertainty. And in that ancient landscape, they worked. But every adaptation has a shadow. What gives strength in one setting may bring strain in another. The same traits that aided survival on the steppe could become burdens when carried into a different world. When the Yamnaya entered the lands of Europe, they brought more than success. They brought risk. Consider the immune system. A body trained to react quickly and strongly to infection is valuable in a place where wounds are common and healing must be fast. But in safer environments, with new foods, less exposure to pathogens and more stability, that same reactivity can turn inward. The body begins to fight itself. Today, many autoimmune disorders show higher prevalence among populations with steppe ancestry. The pattern is not deterministic, but it is present. Or consider stress resilience. Enduring long journeys, harsh winters, and open exposure to danger would have favoured emotional toughness. The ability to suppress fear, to focus under pressure, to act without hesitation. But this kind of resilience may come with a cost, a reduced capacity to process emotion openly, a tendency towards stoicism that, in modern settings, can lead to isolation or difficulty with trust. In its ancestral context, it was adaptive. In others, it may not be. These are the trade-offs written into every gene. Cognitive traits show similar patterns. Populations with steppe ancestry often show elevated traits linked to pattern recognition, systems thinking, and focused attention. These are not diseases. They are simply inherited modes of mind. Useful in some tasks, difficult in others. Today, researchers explore how certain neurodiverse traits may echo ancient adaptations, autism spectrum characteristics, attention sensitivity, high systemizing. These may not be new phenomena, they may be old tools sharpened for a different world. The Yamnaya did not intend to pass down burdens. They passed down what worked for them, what kept their children alive, what allowed their kin groups to thrive, and over generations those traits became embedded in broader populations, mixed with others, shaped by new environments, reframed by new cultures. This is why the story of replacement cannot be reduced to conquest or violence alone. It is also a story of biology, of inherited structure, of how traits suited to one land become the foundation for life in another. And not all of those traits were visible. Many were silent, carried forward not in weapons or tools, but in how people thought, in how they responded to threat, in how they built families, in how they made decisions. And some of those ways endure today, not because they are perfect, but because they were strong enough to last. But strength in human history is never simple. It is not just a matter of muscle or endurance, it is also a matter of inheritance. Who gets to pass on their traits? Who becomes a pattern repeated? Who becomes a whisper that vanishes? And the Yamnaya pattern repeated. Their descendants spread far beyond the open grasslands of their origin. Across Europe and parts of South Asia, their genetic signature, especially on the male line, became dominant. Their social logic travelled with them. Their way of organising households, wealth and power adapted to each new landscape, but it carried echoes of where it began, and so did the bodies. Across later centuries, populations with high steppe ancestry show trends that reach into modernity. Greater average stature, increased bone density, traits associated with physical competitiveness and risk tolerance. Even today, these characteristics are unevenly distributed across regions, yet they still reflect ancient boundaries. But inheritance is not destiny. Because for every trait that once served a purpose, there is a context where it may no longer apply. A strength in one world may be a vulnerability in another, and some traits, like fire, burn both ways. There is increasing research into how genes associated with resilience under stress may also link to tendencies toward aggression, emotional detachment, or rigid thinking. These traits are not faults. They are extremes of a spectrum shaped by selection. In high-threat environments, they increase survival. In cooperative, sedentary settings, they can fracture connection. The same is true for immune function. Heightened vigilance against pathogens may once have saved lives, but in modern environments with processed foods, altered microbiomes, and long lifespans, this same system turns inward. Disorders like Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, or type 1 diabetes are more common in populations with high frequencies of steppe ancestry. This is not about blame, it is about biological memory. Bodies remember conditions long after those conditions have changed, and so the legacy continues, not just in genes but in culture, in assumptions about leadership, in how success is measured, in the values passed down quietly through families, autonomy, endurance, stoicism, pattern mastery. These values are not neutral. They shape systems of education, work, and status. They favour some ways of being. They leave others behind. The Yamnaya did not set out to shape the modern world, but they shaped it all the same, by surviving, by moving, by passing on traits that worked in one time and one place, and then echoing into others. That echo is not finished. It continues, even now. And that is what makes the Yamnaya legacy both fascinating and unsettling. Because it did not end with their expansion. It transformed into something larger. Their adaptations became threads woven through the fabric of later societies. Not in full, not intact, but as echoes. Echoes that shaped what it meant to endure. We tend to think of evolution as something slow, but cultural evolution moves faster than genes. What begins as a trait for survival can, within a few generations, become a story. A story becomes a value becomes a norm. And norms, once widely accepted, reshape the path of history. This is why understanding ancient adaptation matters. The Yamnaya were not mythic giants. They were human. They had strengths. They had flaws. And they carried systems in their bodies, systems shaped by hardship, mobility, and risk. When they became the dominant male lineage across large parts of Europe, they brought those systems with them. The outcome was not inevitable, but it was lasting. Today we still live with the balance they helped set in motion. Many societies continue to favour autonomy over interdependence, strength over softness, structure over nuance. These tendencies are not only cultural choices, they are also shaped by long histories of selection and survival. But what once served a nomadic group on the Eurasian steppe may not serve all communities now. The lesson is not to romanticize the past, nor to reject it. It is to recognize that what we inherit is not always what we need, that our minds and bodies carry memories of landscapes we no longer live in, that resilience can become rigidity, that vigilance can become anxiety, that adaptation does not always mean harmony, and yet the story is not without hope. Because humans are more than inheritance. We are also interpreters. We can understand where traits came from. We can choose which ones to nurture. We can soften what was once hard. We can make space for variation, for contradiction, for new ways of being. The Yamnaya carried forward the structures of survival. But we carry forward the structures of understanding. And now that the evidence has come into view, not just in bones and pottery, but in our very cells, we can begin to see them clearly, not as conquerors or destroyers, but as people who emerge from a world of scarcity with the tools they needed to continue. Tools we still hold. Some of those tools remain useful, some must be put down, but all of them tell us something about where we came from, and about what kind of world we are still building, not through monuments or ruins, but through words. Common, everyday words, spoken by billions of people in hundreds of languages, words for family, for numbers, for the sky, for the body, a quiet inheritance that began with no alphabet and no ink. Only breath, only sound. The Yamnaya left no writing behind, yet today, across much of the planet, people still speak in the rhythm of their tongue. Linguists call it the Indo-European language family, a vast network of related languages stretching from Iceland to India, with deep roots in the prehistoric steppe. It is one of the most enduring legacies of any ancient people, not because they recorded it, but because they repeated it. Spoken by parents to children, carried by travellers and herders, passed along by memory alone, and the trail matches the map. Where the genetic imprint of the Yamnaya spreads, so too does the pattern of Indo-European languages. The overlap is not perfect, but it is striking. In place after place, the arrival of steppe ancestry matches the appearance of new ways of speaking. Languages that share structure, grammar, and deep core vocabulary, even across great distances and thousands of years. Scholars cannot recover the exact words, but by comparing languages that descended from this shared root, they can trace patterns that run like threads through time. Words for mother, father, brother and daughter follow similar forms. So do the words for wheel, horse, and sky. Even after millennia, the shape of the language holds, and through those words we glimpse a world centred around motion, around kin, around livestock and leadership. There are strong terms for male roles within families, and fewer for coastal life or farming. The language reflects what the people valued and what they needed to organise. Herds, travel, lineage, ritual. It was a language built for speaking across distances, for guiding people and animals, for declaring who belonged and who did not. What is most remarkable is how deeply this structure remains embedded. Modern languages like English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, they are distant cousins, but they still echo that same architecture. They follow similar rules for building relationships between words. Many of their oldest terms share a common ancestry. It is not just language that spreads, it is world view. And somehow, through the silence of unwritten generations, the Yamnaya voice endured, not through memory, through use, through rhythm, through the simple act of speaking. And that alone has made it one of the most powerful legacies of all, because language does more than name the world. It organises it. It tells people who they are, where they belong, and what matters. And in the case of the Yamnaya and their descendants, it told them how to move through life. Even though we cannot hear their original speech, the languages that grew from it still carry signs of their values. The structure is often hierarchical. There are clear terms for social rank, for father and elder, for guest and stranger, for those who give orders and those who follow them. These are not just linguistic quirks, they are clues. Clues to a worldview built on kinship, loyalty, and clear lines of authority. Across Indo-European languages, many of the oldest words relate to family roles, not just parent and child, but in-laws, clans, and lineage. The importance of descent, especially through the male line, that is hard to miss. This focus on ancestry would have shaped how people introduced themselves, how they formed alliances, and how they remembered the dead. We also see strong terms for the natural elements: sky, fire, water, day, night. These likely played roles in ritual and myth. In many descendant cultures we find sky gods who wield thunder, fire deities who guard the hearth, and sacred laws tied to the cycles of the sun. These patterns suggest that the early speakers of this language saw the world as full of power, and organised that power into roles, stories, and responsibilities. The presence of specialised vocabulary for herding and mobility adds another layer. There are clear terms for animals, for carts and wheels, for direction and distance. These were people who moved. Their language helped them manage that movement, not only physically but socially. It helped them coordinate, command, persuade, remember, and perhaps most importantly, language helped them absorb. As the Yamnaya and related steppe groups moved into new lands, they encountered other cultures, other tongues. But their way of speaking often took root. Over time it blended with local words, shifted in sound and created new dialects. Yet the core structure remained. In many cases the older languages faded. The Indo-European tree grew stronger. This tells us something about how power travels. Not always through violence, sometimes through vocabulary, through control of names, through shared stories, through the quiet insistence of a language that defines the terms of belonging. It is possible that people adopted these ways of speaking because they opened doors to trade, to status, to protection. It is also possible that over generations the shift was invisible. Children simply learned what was spoken at home, and what was spoken at home had already changed, and in that shift a world was remade, not by force, but by grammar. Because the most enduring power is often not the loudest. It is the kind that reshapes thought without needing to explain itself. And this is one of the quiet strengths of language. It defines categories, it sets boundaries, it decides what can be said easily, and what feels foreign to the tongue. Many Indo-European languages, even today, distinguish sharply between singular and plural, between male and female, between subject and object. They make a habit of placing people in roles. These roles are not always equal, some are higher, some are lower, and once those roles are built into grammar, they become part of how people see the world. Take the way many of these languages handle verbs. Actions are not just things that happen, they are marked by who does them and who receives them. Some languages go further, adding layers of formality, status, or intimacy, depending on who is speaking to whom. All of this creates a system in which relationships are constantly being ranked, not by law but by speech. Over time, this builds habits of mind. It teaches people to notice difference, to assume hierarchy, to sort others based on age, gender, lineage, or allegiance. And because this sorting happens automatically, without conscious effort, it begins to feel natural. Of course, all languages do this to some extent, but the Indo-European branch is especially rich in these features. Its oldest known forms show patterns of strong pronoun systems, elaborate verb endings, and complex kinship terms. These are signs of a culture that placed great emphasis on identity, affiliation, and social structure. And yet, for all its precision, this linguistic system also allowed room for expansion. It could blend with other languages, absorb new words, shift in sound while preserving its skeleton. This is one reason it spread so widely. It was not rigid, it could adapt. But even in its adapted forms, it kept its deeper shape. A shape that reflects a way of thinking as much as a way of speaking. What is spoken often becomes what is thought, and what is thought becomes what is remembered. In this way, the language helped carry forward more than just vocabulary. It carried forward an invisible architecture, a sense of how the world should be arranged, who belongs where, what is right, what is owed. This may be one reason why the story of the Yamnaya took so long to surface. Their legacy was not carved in stone. It was carried in sound, in grammar, in the structure of thought itself, a legacy so quiet it was almost missed. Until the echoes were finally traced backward, through syntax, through speech, through the questions that languages forgot to ask. Because in the end, what survived was not just a sound, it was a structure. And structure is hard to see when it is the thing you are standing on. For most of history, no one thought to ask where their language came from. People simply spoke, the words were useful, the grammar was inherited, and the stories that shaped the world were told in familiar rhythms. But deep in those rhythms was a pattern that had travelled far. And when researchers finally began to study the roots of European and Asian languages side by side, a strange realization emerged. Across great distances, words kept reappearing in altered but recognizable forms. And behind those words was a system, one that had left no writing, but had somehow survived. It was not until the 19th century that this system began to be studied in earnest. Scholars noticed links between classical languages like Greek and Latin, and even older ones like Sanskrit. These similarities were not random. They pointed to a common ancestor, a single family of speech that must have branched out long ago. The name Indo-European was given to that family, and for a time the search was only linguistic. Where had this root language been spoken? Who carried it? Why had it spread? At first, answers were speculative, but then came the genetics, and with the sequencing of ancient DNA, a new picture began to emerge, one that showed a striking overlap between the spread of Indo-European speech and the migration of people from the steppe. Still, there was no temple, no scroll, no king's decree. The people who carried this language left no alphabet, no books, no libraries. They left only the habits of speech, habits so deeply embedded they became invisible, words for the sun and the wheel, for the guest and the stranger, for the bond between siblings, for the order between men. These were not imposed overnight. They were lived, whispered into the ears of children, spoken during meals, traded along with cattle and salt. They took hold in the quiet places of daily life, and from there they spread. That is the strange power of language. It moves without being seen. It shapes without being noticed. And when it becomes dominant, it carries with it not only vocabulary but memory, a memory of how things once were, of who once held the power to name. The Yamnaya may have vanished in form, but their structure endured. It endured not in stone, not in gold, but in the folds of grammar, in the choices of phrasing, in the way people speak of time and family and place, and that endurance is no less real for being silent. Because even now, we live within the walls that language built. We do not see them, we do not question them, but they shape what we notice, what we believe, and what we pass on. The legacy of the Yamnaya was not written, it was spoken. And what they spoke was not just a set of words, but a framework, a way of organising kin, status, movement and law, a way of marking loyalty and defining outsiders, a way of placing people into patterns that could outlive memory. This is why their presence remained long after their names were lost. When Indo-European languages spread across Europe and parts of Asia, they did not simply overwrite older tongues. They fused with them, absorbed them, yet the backbone stayed the same. The grammar, the logic, the categories of thought. Even when the words changed, the underlying structure endured, and through that structure came something more. Myths were reshaped in new language, rituals were retold, power was renamed, and as children learned to speak in the new tongue, they also learned to think through its lens. Over generations, it became natural, unquestioned. The system encoded itself in syntax. What once had to be learned became instinct. Even in places where the Yamnaya blood faded, the shape of their speech remained. It moved through empires. It nested inside laws. It whispered through lullabies and oaths. It marked time. It counted value. It defined the roles of men and women, the names of gods, the terms of debt and honour. And yet, for centuries, no one traced it back. It was only with the rise of comparative linguistics and genetic archaeology that the outlines reappeared. A picture formed of a people who had shaped the future not by inscription, but by repetition. Not by conquest in the obvious sense, but by changing what could be said and heard. This is what makes language such a strange kind of legacy. It is both invisible and intimate. It lives in the breath. It settles in the bones of thought. It does not carry its maker's name, yet it carries their choices. And so, when we speak today, when we form a sentence, when we name a child, when we swear a promise or explain a past, we are not only using a tool, we are echoing a world that no longer exists, but one that never fully went away. Because when the men of the old world vanished, they left behind almost no stories, but someone else arrived, and that someone left a structure so quiet, so persistent, that we still use it now, without knowing whose voice it once was. But not everyone left it unnamed. Thousands of years after the Yamnaya were gone, their echo was rediscovered, not in the earth, but in the sounds of language. In the 19th century, scholars began comparing ancient tongues and found something strange. Latin, Greek and Sanskrit, despite the distances between them, shared deep similarities. Words for family, numbers, gods and tools seemed to follow the same pattern. These languages, and many more, appeared to descend from a common root. The term Indo-European was born to describe this family of languages. But another word also emerged, a word that would prove far more dangerous. That word was Aryan. At first, it was a simple linguistic label. In Sanskrit texts, the word had meant noble or free. European philologists adopted it to describe the hypothetical original speakers of this ancient language. But slowly the word took on weight. It stopped meaning a branch of language and started meaning a race. What followed was not the fault of the Yamnaya, it was the result of projection. In an age obsessed with origins and hierarchy, the discovery of a common ancestor for so many languages was irresistible. Some thinkers imagined a lost Aryan people, tall, warlike, and pure, who had spread civilization through conquest. The myth grew, and as it grew, it detached further from the archaeological and linguistic evidence. These imagined Aryans were placed at the centre of European history. They were credited with inventing art, law, and language. They were said to be the ancestors of every civilized group from Ireland to India. And although the real steppe peoples had left no written record, no statues, no self-portraits, the fantasy filled the silence. That silence created space for invention. Because if the original speakers had left no voice, anyone could speak for them. Their lives could be sketched in clean lines. their faces imagined into sculptures, their values assumed, without contradiction. And from that scaffolding, new narratives were built, not of pastoral nomads on the open plain, but of chosen founders destined to rule. It is here that we begin to see how absence can be dangerous. When a people leave no memory of themselves, they become easy to reshape. The Yamnaya did not speak of themselves. They did not leave stories that survived. So others told stories for them. Stories built not from bones or genes, but from ideology. Stories that were never theirs to begin with. And once these ideas were planted, they were difficult to remove. They made their way into textbooks, into politics, and eventually into some of the darkest chapters of modern history. A people long gone had been transformed into a symbol, not of what they were, but of what others wanted them to be. This is not just a distortion, it is a warning. Because the fantasy did not remain in the hands of scholars, it passed into the realm of politics, and there it was sharpened. In the early 20th century, as Europe moved toward war, the Aryan myth was seized by nationalist movements eager for legitimacy. In Germany especially, the idea of a noble ancestral race became more than a theory. It became a foundation, not for science, but for identity, for empire, for exclusion. The Nazi regime did not invent the concept of Aryan supremacy, but they perfected it into doctrine. In their version of history, the Aryans were not just the ancestors of Indo-European speakers, they were a master race, pure, powerful, and destined to rule. Everyone else became secondary or worse. The archaeological silence of the Yamnaya was filled with banners, statues, and imagined lineages. Entire state programs were built on this illusion. Researchers were ordered to trace bloodlines. Schools taught children about their Aryan heritage. Excavations were reinterpreted to fit the myth. Even prehistory was weaponized, turned into a narrative of racial struggle, with imagined ancestors cast as heroes and their imagined enemies as threats to be removed. But the real steppe people left no such stories. They did not speak of purity. They did not claim dominion. Theirs was a world of mobility, kinship, and survival. It had nothing to do with the rigid racial hierarchies invented centuries later. Yet the silence left room. And into that room, fantasy poured. The danger was not only in the lie, it was in how believable it became. The Aryan myth fit neatly into existing fears and desires. It promised a glorious past and a justifiable future. It gave people a sense of belonging at the cost of truth. And once adopted, it became difficult to dismantle, because it was no longer just an idea. It had become part of national pride, of education, of law. Even the symbols were taken. The swastika, once a sacred emblem in multiple ancient cultures, was stripped of its original meaning and used as a badge of racial identity. Linguistic studies that had begun with curiosity became tools of exclusion, and behind it all was a ghost, not of a people, but of a silence misused. The Yamnaya did not raise these banners. They did not write these theories, but their absence was made to serve them, and so a people who had no kings, no written myths, and no cities were imagined into an empire they never knew. They became what others needed them to be, and in doing so they became something they never were. After the war, when the full consequences of racial ideology were laid bare, the academic world began to recoil from the very terms it had helped to shape. The word Aryan was gradually abandoned in linguistic studies, replaced by more neutral labels like Indo-European or Indo-Iranian. There was a renewed caution, a desire to disconnect science from the ideologies that had co-opted it. But myths do not vanish easily. In popular culture and fringe politics, the fantasy of the noble Aryan endured. It surfaced in pseudo-historical books, in esoteric movements, in symbols quietly revived and meanings once again twisted. The silence of the steppe people remained fertile ground, and even without mainstream approval, the illusion lingered. What complicated the recovery of truth was the absence of first-hand voices. The Yamnaya, like many prehistoric peoples, left no writing. They had no chronicles, no origin stories carved in stone. What they left behind was physical: bones, pottery, burial mounds, and later genetic traces in the living. These fragments resist easy interpretation. They do not speak, they wait. Into that waiting space, modern archaeology stepped with more care. New tools emerged: radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA, isotope analysis. Slowly the fantasy gave way to detail. The Yamnaya were revealed not as warriors of myth, but as herders, movers, adapters. Their culture was dynamic. Their ancestry was mixed. Their migrations were real, but their motivations, their social structures, their inner lives were far more complex than conquest alone. The paternal lineage shift across Europe remained staggering, but it no longer pointed to a single moment of violence. It pointed to waves of change, to shifting alliances, to new hierarchies, yes, but also to cooperation, absorption, and adaptation. The story became harder to simplify, and that was a good thing. Yet even now, echoes of the old illusion surface. You can still find maps coloured to suggest purity. You can still find slogans that invoke Aryan descent. And sometimes, even in well-meaning discourse, the temptation to reduce complex histories into binary myths remains. That temptation is powerful. It offers clarity, identity. A narrative with clear heroes and clear lines. But prehistory rarely grants such things. It is messy. It is layered. It is filled with gaps that resist closure. And in those gaps, we have a choice. We can project, or we can listen. Listening means accepting uncertainty. It means understanding that the people of the past were neither saints nor monsters, that they were shaped by needs, by landscapes, by pressures we no longer face, that their story is not ours to own but to uncover. And so, the question remains, what do we do with a silence this large? Do we fill it with what we wish had been true? Or do we follow the evidence, even when it leads somewhere harder to explain? The answer, in recent years, has begun to tilt toward the second path. Advances in ancient DNA have offered a new lens, one that does not rely on symbols or statues but on biology itself, and what that lens shows is not purity, but movement. Not a master race, but a mosaic. The genetic trail of the Yamnaya, once barely visible, now stretches from the Ukrainian and Russian steppes into the heart of Europe and beyond. It does not spread evenly, and it does not overwrite everything, but it does leave a clear signal. The Y chromosomes they carried appear in large numbers in modern European men, yet their arrival did not erase the maternal ancestry that was already there. This asymmetry tells us something more nuanced than myth ever allowed. It tells us of encounters, not just invasions, of unions, not just conquests, of societies reshaped not only by force, but by adaptation, exchange, and complexity. The archaeological record supports this. Steppe-related material culture blends with local traditions. Burial practices shift but do not vanish. Pottery styles evolve through fusion, not replacement. Language, too, adapts, absorbing local words, shaping new dialects. What emerges is not a people imposing themselves on another like a stamp. It is a long, uneven process of mixing. This picture is harder to dramatize. It does not lend itself to slogans, but it is closer to truth. And yet, even this more complex story is vulnerable, not to silence, but to noise. In the age of the internet, misinformation spreads faster than evidence. Simplified diagrams, half-understood genetics, and romanticized visuals circulate widely. And so, the old Aryan illusion returns, not as science, but as viral content. On forums and channels, the myth is repackaged for a new audience, younger, angrier, and hungry for meaning. Here the stakes grow clear, because the misuse of prehistory is not just a mistake. It becomes a tool, a means of shaping how people see themselves and others, a way of deciding who belongs and who does not. And that is why it matters how we tell these stories. To say that a people once vanished is one thing. To claim they were meant to vanish is another. And when the gaps in the record are filled with ideology, the past is no longer a mirror. It becomes a weapon. What the Yamnaya actually were, pastoralist, travellers, adaptable, is far more interesting than what the myths made of them. Their strength was not in imagined purity. It was in resilience, in the ability to survive in motion, to carry family across distance, to face hardship and endure. That, not conquest, may be their truest legacy. And so we return again to silence. But this time we carry better questions. We no longer seek purity. We no longer imagine golden tribes bearing the torch of civilization. What we seek now is harder and far more honest. We ask how people lived, how they moved, how they changed. We ask what it meant to belong to a group that would one day be forgotten, and how memory can bend under the pressure of myth. The silence left by the Yamnaya is not empty. It is filled with movement, with fragments, with quiet echoes of lives lived close to the land. It is filled with the sound of herds and wheels, of children learning speech patterns shaped by landscapes now lost. It is filled with the choices people made about who they would follow, who they would bury, and who they would become. That kind of silence deserves respect. The myth of the Aryan race erased that respect. It replaced real questions with fantasies. It took the soft, steady migration of families across the steppe and turned it into a march of destiny. It dressed shepherds in armour they never wore and placed crowns on heads that never ruled. Now, we know better. We know that no group is pure, that history does not unfold in straight lines, that the most enduring legacies are often not the loudest ones but the ones embedded in the smallest shifts. A word borrowed, a burial shared, a child born of two worlds. We also know that power does not always arrive with banners. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through quiet replacement, through the reshaping of inheritance, through patterns that only become visible thousands of years later when we sequence the genes and listen to what they preserved. That is what makes this part of the story so powerful and so dangerous. Because if we do not tell it carefully, it can be twisted again. So we tell it with caution. We say what the data shows, we say what it does not, and we remain wary of those who claim to know more than the evidence allows. The Yamnaya were real, their impact was real, but the empire others built from their memory was a fiction. And when we clear that fiction away, we find something more enduring, a people who survived not through domination, but through adaptability, who shaped Europe not through myth, but through mixture. They did not write their names in stone. They wrote them into us, and now it is our turn to speak with care. Because the story of the Yamnaya does not end in Europe. It stretches further east, into lands shaped not by glaciers, but by monsoon and mountain, into valleys where rivers carve green lifelines through stone, into cultures that would preserve memory not in pottery or burial, but in verse. What we call the Indo-European expansion is not a single event. It is a long unfolding, a migration not of armies alone, but of families, rituals, and words. And nowhere is that more clearly felt than in the Indian subcontinent, a place where the steppe legacy still echoes, not only in the genome, but in religion, tradition, and debate. In the foothills of the Hindu Kush and the Upper Indus region, ancient DNA has told a quiet story. Thousands of years ago, a population with ancestry traceable to the Pontic-Caspian steppe began appearing in what is now northern Pakistan. Their genetic signal is clearest in the Swat Valley, a place long thought of as a cultural crossroads. Here, in burial grounds and settlement layers, we find traces of a people whose heritage blended with local agriculturalists and mountain foragers. The genetic data does not show conquest. It shows mixture. It shows steppe ancestry entering the region and slowly becoming part of the population. But alongside that ancestry came something else, a language, and with that language, a worldview. The earliest layers of what would become Sanskrit begin to emerge in this context. The Vedic tradition, rooted in oral hymns composed over generations, carries within it echoes of steppe imagery, chariots, horses, sky gods, sacred fires. These were not inventions of India, but neither were they foreign impositions. They were part of the slow weaving of identities that happens when people move, settle, and begin to belong. This process was not recorded in chronicles, it was remembered in verse. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts in any Indo-European tongue, speaks not of empires, but of rhythm, of ritual, of cosmic order. It remembers the horse not as a symbol of war, but of sacrifice and renewal. And in these metaphors we glimpse something older than kingdoms, a way of seeing the world that joined land, language, and lineage into something sacred. But as with Europe, the silence of the original migrants has left space for interpretation, and as with Europe, that space has been filled many times, with scholarship, with politics, and with yearning. Because the past in South Asia is not just history, it is identity. An identity once shaped is difficult to reshape, yet the evidence continues to grow. and the questions it raises are not just about ancestry, but about what it means to belong. Yet the evidence continues to grow, and the questions it raises are not just about ancestry, but about what it means to belong. In the Vedic tradition, belonging was defined not only by blood, but by participation in sacred order. The rituals recorded in the oldest hymns do not describe temples or gods with faces, they describe acts, sequences, fires kindled in the right direction, offerings given with the right words. The divine was not in statues, it was in the rhythm. Among these acts, one stands out with particular force, the horse sacrifice. Known in later Sanskrit as Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice appears as a central, though rare, ritual of kingship. It is not merely a performance, it is a cosmic statement, a declaration that the king's authority reaches to the edges of the known world. That his breath is tied to the breath of the sky. The ritual's scale, complexity, and symbolism suggest roots older than any single culture, and when scholars traced its parallels, they found similar echoes in other Indo-European societies, in Iran, in ancient Rome, even in early Celtic traditions. The horse, in these cases, was more than an animal. It was a link between realms, a bearer of motion, a symbol of control over chaos, and it was a companion of chariots. The chariot too arrives with meaning. Light, fast, and often drawn by two horses, it was not a machine of conquest alone, it was a marker of status, of ritual precision, of divine favour. In the Rig Veda, the gods themselves ride chariots. The sun is imagined as drawn across the sky by golden wheels. Heroes win races, not just battles, and the wheels themselves are described in detail, not as tools of war, but as things that must turn in balance. These are not the images of a conquering horde. They are the metaphors of a migrating culture, one that carried memory and movement and shaped its power in poetry. Yet beneath these metaphors, something real was happening. A new language was spreading, a new ritual order was taking shape. And the people who spoke that language were forming a new kind of social identity, not based solely on clan, but on shared speech and sacred lore. This is the steppe legacy in its most lasting form. Not domination, not erasure, but structure. Language is a structure, ritual is a structure, and once built, they hold. Even when the people who first brought them are gone, these structures remain. They are absorbed, reshaped, and continued. And in this continuation, the past survives. Not as memory, but as grammar. But grammar, like ancestry, can become a question of power. And in South Asia, that question still burns. In modern India, the story of origins is not only a scientific pursuit, it is a mirror for contemporary identity. Who arrived first? Who shaped the language? Who built the oldest rituals? These are not idle questions. They are wrapped in ideas of heritage, status, and belonging. And as genetic evidence from the Swat Valley and surrounding regions deepens, it enters not just academic debate, but political discourse. This is not new. The 19th century brought colonial interpretations that sought to divide, to trace lines between so-called Aryan invaders and native populations. These frameworks, flawed and often intentionally biased, left deep scars. After independence, there was a desire to push back, to reclaim narrative, to imagine an India wholly born from within. So when modern genetics suggested that steppe ancestry played a role in shaping the northern gene pool and that Indo-European languages likely arrived through ancient migrations, the reaction was mixed. Some welcomed the clarity, others challenged the premise. The difficulty lies not in the data, but in the emotion. Because for many to suggest that foundational elements of culture, language, ceremony, cosmology, came from outside the subcontinent feels like a loss. It raises old wounds about identity and autonomy. It brings back the fear of being told that greatness was imported. But the science does not say that. It says something else. It says the story is older than conquest. That mixture is not erasure. That what came from the steppe did not replace what was already in place. It joined it. In the Swat Valley, the archaeological layers tell the story more clearly than any text. Before the arrival of steppe-related ancestry, there were already settled agriculturalists. After it, there was blending. New burial styles appeared, but they shared space with older ones. New technologies were adopted, but not all at once. The continuity of local tradition remains strong. The story is one of slow fusion, not sudden takeover. This is important. Because when we talk about ancestry, we are not just describing genes, we are describing the movement of people, the formation of families, the reshaping of identity over time. And these things do not happen cleanly. They happen in the mess of real life. The Vedic texts, too, are not written in a single voice. They are layered, composed over generations, reflecting a long period of synthesis between steppe and subcontinent, between language and land. This is what modern genetics and archaeology reveal, not a single origin, but a complex braid. And yet, even this braid can become contested, because in the present, identity often seeks clarity, and the past refuses to give it. Science moves slowly. It is built on fragments, probabilities, and patterns. It cannot always offer the clean answers that nations desire. But identity, especially in a place as diverse and ancient as India, often longs for roots, for wholeness, for a story that feels complete. And when science complicates that story, it can feel like disruption. This is the challenge of prehistoric research in the modern world. The facts uncovered in ancient DNA do not stay in the lab. They enter classrooms, editorials, public debates. They are interpreted, misinterpreted, and sometimes weaponized. A single study can be cited in support of multiple opposing claims. Some voices reject the idea that Indo-European languages came from outside the subcontinent. They argue instead for an indigenous origin, pointing to continuity in local traditions, deep time settlement, and the absence of large-scale destruction. Others see the genetic findings as proof of an ancient migration, not a conquest, but a slow movement of peoples whose culture eventually became dominant in the north. Both views contain partial truths, and both are shaped by more than just data. They are shaped by memory, politics, and the human desire for coherence. What the archaeological and genetic evidence suggest is more subtle, that the story of the subcontinent is one of layered arrivals, that no single group can claim exclusive authorship, that the languages spoken, the rituals practiced, and the faces seen today are the result of thousands of years of mixture. This does not erase identity. It deepens it. To belong to India, or to any place, is to carry multiple inheritances. Farmers from the Indus, foragers from the hills, herders from the steppe. Each left something behind, a gesture, a sound, a seed. And though these people did not know each other, their traces now live together, in genomes, in language, in food and ceremony. To reduce that complexity to a single origin is not to honour it. It is to flatten it. But complexity is difficult to hold, especially when narratives of origin are used to claim power. In recent years, debates over ancient migrations have sparked tensions. Some groups argue that foreign origin stories undermine national pride. Others fear the erasure of tribal and southern lineages. Scholars, meanwhile, try to navigate carefully, to present evidence without igniting division. This is the weight that ancient history carries in the modern world. It is no longer just about what happened. It is about who gets to tell the story. And yet, behind the noise, the data continues to accumulate. More sites are sequenced, more timelines clarified, and with each layer, the past becomes not simpler, but clearer. Because even when identity demands borders, ancestry refuses them. Because even when identity demands borders, ancestry refuses them. The Indo-European languages now spoken across half the world did not spread by accident, but they also did not spread by decree. They moved with people, with families, with generations of migration, marriage and memory. In South Asia, that movement settled into a rhythm, a fusion of ritual, tongue and time that gave rise to the Vedic tradition and everything that flowed from it. And yet the people who first carried that language are gone. The Yamnaya left no cities, no texts, no monuments. Their influence endures only in what others became after them. In the rhythms of poetry, in the structure of prayers, in the shape of words spoken every day across thousands of miles. This is not a legacy of purity, it is a legacy of mixture. The steppe herders did not replace entire civilizations. They entered them, they merged, and over centuries something new emerged. Not Yamnaya, not Harappan, not tribal, not imperial, but a composite lineage that cannot be reduced to one name. In this way, the story of South Asia mirrors the story of Europe, In both places, steppe ancestry arrived not with the collapse of culture, but with the birth of new ones. Languages changed, lineages shifted. Social orders reformed, but life continued. The debate today often misses this point. It sees migration as threat, admixture as loss, but the archaeological and genetic records say otherwise. They show that mixture is the default. That identity, like soil, is built from layers. In the end, the Yamnaya presence in India did not overwrite the past. It was added to it. This matters. Because in the modern world, where old ideas of blood and soil still echo, prehistory reminds us of something simpler, that no one is pure, that every language we speak is an inheritance from strangers, that every tradition we hold is stitched from many hands. And this is where the story turns again, back to the steppe, back to the people who came from its grasses and thundered into so many future lineages. But they did not know what would follow. They did not name the languages we would use. They did not predict the stories that would be told in their name. They only moved, lived, carried what they could, and in doing so, left behind traces we are only now beginning to read. The past does not tell us who we are, it only shows us how we came to be, and sometimes that is enough. The wind still moves across the steppe, the rivers still cut through the Swat Valley, and the language of long-forgotten ancestors still lingers in the breath of those who never knew their names. But the Yamnaya left more than words. They left a framework, a way of ordering the world that outlived their migrations, a structure passed not through parchment or prophecy, but through bloodlines, customs, and deeply held expectations of who leads and who follows. They did not write poems, but they shaped laws, not with ink, but with inheritance. Across the vast spaces they entered, from Hungary to Haryana, the echoes of that structure remain. Patrilineal descent, male succession, the idea that authority flows through fathers and that power, once taken, must be protected by oaths, bonds, and the loyalty of men sworn to other men. This is not unique to the Yamnaya, but it becomes especially visible in the archaeological and genetic aftermath of their spread. Before their arrival, many Neolithic societies in Europe seem to have been more balanced. The burials suggest a mix of male and female prestige. The homes show no obvious hierarchy. The tools, the art, the figurines, they speak of community, of households, of a life woven around land and kin. After the Yamnaya, something changes. Graves begin to cluster around dominant males. Some men are buried with weapons and wagons, others are left without markers. Settlement patterns shift, authority appears more centralized, and across thousands of sites, a new pattern of ancestry begins to harden, one in which a single male lineage dominates an entire region. This is not conquest in the way history usually remembers it. There are no named kings, no great campaigns, no imperial borders carved in stone, but the genetic record is unmistakable. In place after place, the paternal diversity narrows. One lineage replaces many, and that lineage stays. It stays through repetition, through the weight of expectation, through stories passed from father to son that define what it means to be a man, a leader, a founder of lines, and it stays through marriage, through alliances formed not by emotion but by strategy. Women move between groups, men remain to guard the inheritance. Over time, this creates not just a structure of power, but a psychology of it, a worldview, one where hierarchy feels natural, where authority descends from above, where the past is not just remembered, but claimed, through ancestry, through blood, through the right to name the next in line. This is the legacy that survives not in myth, but in practice, in surnames, in coats of arms, in royal lineages that stretch backward into shadows no historian can fully trace. And it all begins with men who left no writing, but whose decisions still speak. Across much of Europe and parts of Asia, the social foundations we live within bear their fingerprints. Not in symbols carved on stone, but in patterns, who holds property, who inherits land, who names the children. These are not simply traditions, they are systems, reinforced over time, passed along more firmly than language, more deeply than law. What entered with the Yamnaya was not just DNA. It was a structural bias, a tilt toward male-centered succession, toward vertical inheritance, toward the idea that the past justifies the present because of what is carried through the father's line. Even today, in many rural areas, the echo of this is felt. Last names passed down paternally, sons expected to stay, daughters expected to marry out. The land remains in one name, one house, one line. And when that line breaks, the structure falters. Genetics confirms what culture concealed. The dominance of particular Y chromosome haplogroups, especially R1b in Western Europe and R1a farther east, is not the result of natural selection in the biological sense. It is cultural selection, generationally amplified through systems of control, privilege and reproduction. This is why we can find in modern populations a handful of male lineages that account for vast numbers of descendants. Some estimates suggest that a single ancestral male living thousands of years ago may be the paternal ancestor of millions alive today, not because he had more children in his lifetime, but because the structure around him allowed his line to expand while others quietly disappeared. This kind of shaping leaves no battlefield, no temple, but it leaves bones, and bones now speak. In the genomic data, we see how sharply the diversity collapsed. In some regions, over 90% of male lineages were replaced within a few centuries, and yet the women remained. The mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers, shows a continuity that spans both before and after the shift. This pattern of asymmetrical replacement is not common in ancient population events. It suggests that what happened was not random, that it was not driven by environment alone. Something, or someone, changed the rules. Perhaps it was a new form of hierarchy, or a system in which young males were more expendable, but elite males more reproductively dominant. Or perhaps it was marriage practice, group absorption through female movement, while male competition intensified. Whatever the cause, the effect is lasting. What we inherit today is not just the language or the genes. We inherit the hierarchy that shaped which genes survived. And that hierarchy, once built, does not vanish. It adapts. We carry its outline in family trees, in names traced through fathers, in the silent expectation that someone must lead and that others must follow. None of this is conscious. It is structure more than story, a background pattern that governs inheritance, allegiance, even law. It shaped the architecture of kingship. It shaped the design of lineages and dynasties, and it continues to shape institutions today. Across much of Eurasia, even long after the Yamnaya themselves vanished, the systems they favoured continued to echo. Patrilineal clans, warrior elites, bonds of loyalty sealed not by documents, but by oaths sworn between men. These were the seeds of later feudal systems, of tribal monarchies, of hierarchies rooted in blood. Archaeology does not show this with monuments. It shows it with graves, men buried with weapons, with horses, with symbols of control, and in contrast the graves of women, often fewer, often less adorned but always present, as if the society depended on their continuity even as it celebrated male dominance. In genetics, the same pattern repeats. Mitochondrial diversity remains stable. Y chromosome diversity plummets, which means women moved, married, adapted, while the male lines were culled and replaced. This is not necessarily the result of organised violence. It may have been structural, systemic. A shift in how households were formed and how status was inherited. A society that favours a narrow band of elite males will, over time, produce exactly the pattern we see today. A handful of dominant paternal lines and the disappearance of countless others, and that disappearance is permanent. Once a Y chromosome lineage vanishes, it cannot return. It is not hidden. It is erased. The bones of those men may still lie in the ground, but their genetic echo ends there. This is what makes the concept of the unseen architect so compelling, because these changes were not necessarily planned. They were not dictated by law. They were enforced by culture, by pressure, by opportunity, and once they began, they carried forward without conscious intent. We inherit not only their blood, but their framework. We repeat their shapes in our systems. We speak their hierarchies through language, ritual, and expectation, even if we have forgotten their names. There is something haunting about that, to realise that we are shaped by the preferences of men whose graves we will never find. That our politics, our institutions, our assumptions about power may still follow pathways carved by migrations so deep they fall outside recorded history. But this is not fate. It is memory written into structure. It can be studied, it can be understood, and once understood, it can be questioned. Because what we inherit is not what we must preserve, it is what we must learn how to see. The structures left behind by prehistoric men are not confined to burial mounds or genetic markers. They remain embedded in law, in social expectation, in the quiet hierarchies that define who gets to speak and who is expected to listen. Across continents, surnames still flow through fathers. Titles still descend along male lines. Lineage is often still measured in male continuity. These are not universal rules. But they are deeply rooted, and many of them trace their ancestry to a time when power moved alongside migration, and where continuity came not through consensus, but through dominance. What makes this history so difficult to see is its lack of documentation. The Yamnaya wrote no laws, they left no tablets. Their influence endures not through proclamation, but through selection. And so their legacy is not found in scripture or song. It is found in what survives, and what does not. Even now, much of the modern world is shaped by the idea that power must be protected by lineage. That authority is justified by origin. That memory begins when it is inherited, and ends when the line is broken. These are ideas older than nations, they are older than writing, and they do not need to be true to be powerful, they only need to be repeated. In the last decade, studies of ancient DNA have begun to show how tightly human culture and human biology can become entangled. Not just in what traits persist, but in who is allowed to persist, in who becomes a founder and who becomes forgotten. This, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of the male line collapse in prehistoric Europe. It shows how quietly a society can erase its own foundations, not with war, not with catastrophe, but with preference, with practice, with rules no one remembers agreeing to, but everyone continues to follow. And still, the maternal line endured. Through all of this, women remained the bridge, their genes continued, their children carried the future, their movements connected groups that would otherwise have stayed divided, and in the genetic record, they are the thread that ties the Neolithic past to the present moment. It is a reminder that endurance does not always come from dominance. Sometimes it comes from flexibility, from quiet continuity, from outlasting change, rather than controlling it. The bones do not lie, they carry no opinion, they only show what happened. But what happened shaped what followed, and what followed became the structure of the world we now inhabit. A world built not just on survival, but on who was allowed to survive. We walk through that inheritance every day. We speak its grammar. We live in the systems that emerged from it. And yet we rarely see it for what it is, a pattern left behind by those who vanished, not by accident, but by design. It is tempting to look back and imagine a story, to seek a villain, to assign a purpose, but the truth held in the data is not so simple. It was not one event, not one conquest. It was a shift, vast, uneven, and slow enough to be forgotten, but fast enough to leave a break in the record. A break that still shapes who we think we are. 9 out of 10 paternal lines disappeared. But their lives were not meaningless. Their presence shaped the land. Their memory lives on not through names, but through the absence they left behind. Through the contrast. Through the question they placed at the beginning of this story. What can silence the fathers of a continent and still leave the children? It is not an answer we fully possess, but we now know how to ask it. We know how to read the soil. To listen to the genome, to walk carefully through the places where villages once stood and hear the echo of lives too quiet to carve their names into stone. That silence is not emptiness, it is evidence, and it asks us to pay attention to more than just what remains. It asks us to notice what is missing. Because even the systems that shape our world today, of status, lineage, memory, began somewhere. They were not inevitable, they were chosen, and then repeated. They became what we call tradition, then law, then identity. But buried beneath them, there is always the trace of another way, a different rhythm of life. A world where power was held in other hands, and perhaps will be again. Sometimes legacy is not written in monuments, it is carried in silence. In systems so deep we forget they have an origin. In words so old we no longer ask who first spoke them. This is not the story of a fall. It is not the story of a conquest. It is the story of a turning, a migration of blood, a reordering of ancestry, and with it, the quiet establishment of structures that now feel as natural as the sky. But they are not the sky. They are scaffolds, and like all scaffolds, they can be seen, they can be understood, and once seen, they can be questioned. We do not tell this story to undo the past. We tell it to understand the present, and sometimes the only way to see clearly is to begin with what vanished. The bones whisper, the mothers remember, and somewhere in our blood a silent history waits to be heard again. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this quiet road through deep time, piecing together a forgotten migration, a vanished fatherhood, a legacy carved not in monuments, but in memory. If this story gave you pause, sparked a new thought, softened your mind for sleep, or simply reminded you of the strangeness of being here at all, thank you for giving it your time. I wonder what part will stay with you. A word, a face that never had a name, or the silence where a name should be. Whether it was the image of a missing paternal thread, the quiet persistence of the mothers, or the thought that power once travelled not by throne but by blood. These fragments are what connect us. If any of it lingered, feel free to share it in the comments, as a quiet offering to others walking this same trail of thought. And if you'd like to keep wandering, there are more stories on the way, of forgotten worlds, strange ancestors, and how we came to be. Until we meet again, stay curious. Stay thoughtful.